Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cyber in Practice, Episode 9. I'm Lewis Knox, and in this episode, we examine brute force attacks and how account lockout policies help defend authentication systems. We'll review how attackers attempt repeated password guesses and how Windows security controls can automatically respond to suspicious login activity. Then we'll move on to a live demonstration inside a Windows 11 virtual machine. Before we begin the lab, let's first break down what a brute force attack actually is. What is a brute force attack? A brute force attack is a technique where attackers repeatedly attempt different password combinations to gain access to an account or system. These attacks are commonly automated, allowing thousands of password guesses to be tested rapidly. If passwords are weak or reused, attackers may eventually gain access to sensitive resources. To help reduce this risk, organizations use defensive controls such as account lockout policies and authentication monitoring. Now that we understand the attack method itself, let's look at why these protections are critical to enterprise environments. When authentication systems lack proper protection, attackers can continue guessing passwords until they eventually succeed. That can lead to compromised accounts, privilege escalation, and broader access across the environment. In enterprise networks, even one exposed account can create significant operational and security risks. To reduce that exposure, organizations implement lockout controls that interrupt repeated login failures before attackers can continue. To understand how these controls operate, let's review the security concept used throughout this demonstration. This demonstration focuses on several core authentication security concepts. We'll review account lockout thresholds, field login tracking, password policy enforcement, and login authoring. We'll also discuss how additional protections such as multi-factor authentication strengthens authentication security even further. During the live labs, these controls will be configured directly through Windows Local Security Policy. Now that we've covered the foundational concepts, let's outline the goals for today's demonstration. In this demonstration, we'll be configuring and testing Windows account lockout protection inside a controlled virtual environment. We will start by opening Local Security Policy and navigating to Authentication Security Settings. From there, we'll configure the lockout threshold that determines how many field login attempts are allowed before an account becomes restricted. After the policy is applied, we'll simulate a repeated failed password attempt against the test account. Finally, we'll observe how Windows responds once the field login threshold has been exceeded. Now that we've outlined the goals of the lab, let's take a look at the environment where the demonstration will be performed. This isolated lab environment is configured specifically for defensive policy testing and authentication control validation. During the demonstration, we'll configure security settings, trigger failed login attempts, and observe how Windows enforces account protection policies in real time. Now that the environment is ready, let's begin by opening the Windows Local Security Policy Management Console and configuring the account lockout settings. This workflow demonstrates how authentication defense responds during a brute force attack attempt. First, an attacker begins repeatedly testing password combinations against a targeted account. As those field passwords are submitted, the authentication system logs and tracks each invalid login attempt. Once the number of failed attempts reaches the configured security threshold, the account lockout policy activates automatically. At that point, the system temporarily blocks additional authentication attempts and prevents the attacker from continuing password guesses. This defensive process helps reduce automated credential attacks and strengthens overall authentication security. Now that we understand the authentication defense workflow conceptually, let's move on to the live demonstration and configure these protections directly inside Windows. First, I'll open the Windows Startup menu and launch Local Security Policy using secpol.msc. This management console allows administrators to configure authentication and security-related policy within Windows operating system. Now that the local security policy is open, we'll navigate to the account lockout settings. As you can see, for this demonstration, the threshold has been set to 3 invalid login attempts. This means that after 3 failed password entries, Windows will temporarily lock the account to prevent additional authentication attempts. This defensive control helps slow automated password guessing attacks and reduce the risk of unauthorized access. Now that the security policy has been configured, we'll prepare the account for testing. Next, I'm signing out the current Windows session. This prepares the environment for the authentication testing phase of the demonstration. We'll now simulate repeated failed password attempts against the account. Now we'll begin triggering the account lockout policy. I'm now entering multiple incorrect passwords against the test account. As each invalid login attempt occurs, Windows continues tracking the failed authentication attempts in real time. Once the configured threshold is exceeded, the account lockout protection should activate automatically. After exceeding the allowed number of failed attempts, we can now observe the system response. As you can see, the account has now been temporarily locked. Windows is denying additional authentication attempts because the failed login threshold has been reached. This demonstrates how account lockout policies help defend systems against brute force attacks and repeated unauthorized login attempts. In enterprise environments, protections like these help reduce account compromise risk and limit automatic credentials attacks. Now that we successfully demonstrated the lockout protection in action, let's review key takeaways. Account lockout policies are an important defensive control against brute force attacks. Monitoring failed logins improves visibility into suspicious authentication behaviors. Strong password policies and multi-factor authentication provides additional protection beyond passwords alone. When combined together, these layer controls significantly strengthen enterprise authentication security.
Thank you for watching Cyber in Practice. If you enjoyed this demonstration, stay tuned for future Cyber in Practice episodes.